Why would you do that? Why don't you just wait for your husband? Are you not waiting on the Lord? Are you not, you know what I mean? Like, essentially that I'm taking my own life into my hands. And
Hey, girlfriends, welcome to another episode of Girlfriends and Goals. We're your hosts, Miosha
and Samaria.
This podcast is a space where we'll talk about friendships, life goals, a little bit of pop culture, and all things womanhood.
Our top goal this year is to grow our podcast audience. So if you're new here or you're an avid listener of this podcast, please subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating, write a review, and be sure to share this episode with a girlfriend or two.
We actually have a special guest for today's episode. Stacey-Ann, welcome back to the Girlfriends and Goals podcast.
thank you so much.
Yes, and hopefully you had a chance to listen to the last episode she was on, which was Sis Stop Doing Too Much. She graced us with her presence there, so she'll be joining us for today.
Yes. And before we get into today's topic, we start with a segment. Today's segment is Girlfriend Check-In. And today we're using a question from the We're Not Really Strangers conversation starter game. And the question today is, what is your happiest memory in the last year? So Stacey-Ann, we'll start with you.
Thank you. This one is very easy for me. My happiest memory was getting to see my parents for the first time since December 2019 in March of 2021. So they flew in and stayed with me here in the Metro Atlanta area. And yeah, I hadn't seen my parents. I think that's the longest I have gone without seeing my parents in my entire life. That's the happiest memory easily, hands down. And they're great. They're in good health. So it was wonderful.
Yes, I'm pretty sure many people can relate to that, given the last 2 years that we've had and having to be quarantined and separated. So I'm happy to hear that you were able to connect with them.
Miosha, what about you?
Oh, Samaria, you're going to get me because I actually have two and I can't decide, but I'll make them quick. The first happiest memory that I have within the last year is one, starting this podcast with Samaria. More specifically, the day that we did our first photo shoot. Looking back on that day was one, so much fun, but two, kind of emotional because I feel like it was just a good time to reflect back on all the time that we've been together and the memories and the pictures and videos that we have. So that's my first happiest memory. And then the second is my child's first birthday party. That day was so much fun. I literally walked around the whole day feeling like it was my first birthday, even though it wasn't, I know. But yeah, those are my two happiest memories of the last year.
Listen, he's not going to remember it. So it pretty much was your first birthday, girl.
Okay.
So my happiest memory was going back to Liberia for the first time after several years. So I've always kept in touch with my family there. And I don't know, I've always missed home and longed for that day when I would go back. So just being there and meeting the new kids. So obviously, since the last time I was there, my cousins have had children who I've never met or even talked to. And just getting to meet them and play with them and fall in love with them, have them fall in love with me. That was really, really special. So that was my happiest memory in the last year.
Okay.
So it is the month of March, which is Women's History Month. So as we started last week, we're going to shout out a woman-owned business. And this week we are shouting out Amaris Janelle from Events by Amaris Janelle. She is an event planner here in Atlanta, Georgia. And she does social events, a day of coordination for weddings, and then full-on wedding planning. And she's someone who I followed for quite some time. We also went to school together, went to college together, but, just kind of knew each other in passing. But it's just really phenomenal what she's built, and just seeing her work is really inspiring. So I wanted to share her for this week's spotlight. Yeah,
Oh,
so that's it. Emrys Janelle, and then I'll like leave the information in the description so that people can follow her and see her work as well.
all right. We're going to jump into today's topic, which is exploring your fertility options, more specifically, the process of freezing your eggs. And how we got to this topic is the last time that we had Stacey-Ann on, randomly after we finished recording, we started talking about freezing your eggs. And Samira and I realized that neither one of us had really any experience or know anyone close to us that has been through that process, and it piqued our interest. And while we were talking, Stacey-Ann let us know that she had gone through the process of freezing her eggs. And so we thought it would be great to have her back on today to just share some of her own personal experiences with our audience. So Stacey-Ann, I guess I'll start with asking you just to tell us a little bit about how you came to this decision to embark on this journey to freeze your eggs. And an example is, how long did it take you to get there? How old were you? Anything that you feel comfortable with sharing.
Thank you so much, Miosha. I am going to be an open book, so you all should feel free to ask me anything. There's probably nothing I'll be uncomfortable with asking. I'm really gonna spill the tea. I'm gonna tell you all of it so that people can have all of the information. So I was 40 years old when I decided to freeze my eggs, and how it came about. So I was 40 then. I am 44 and a half now. I'll be 45 this summer. So one of my very close friends from college, she and I have birthdays 2 weeks apart. And I was calling her for her birthday. Her birthday's 2 weeks before mine, I should say. I was calling her for her birthday when she turned 40. And I was like, hey, happy 40th, blah, blah, blah. And we're catching up about her and her husband and her two wonderful children, all this. And then suddenly the conversation, like you could literally feel the energy of the conversation shift. And she was just like, Stacey, so are you going to freeze your eggs? Like literally. I mean, that's like when we've been friends since we were 18, so we can talk about anything. She was just like, "So what's going on? Like, are you gonna freeze your eggs? I really think you should consider freezing your eggs." And I really told her I knew what egg freezing was. I generally understood what it was, generally understood how it happened, but I never really thought about it seriously. I always thought, oh, I'm gonna wait to find my Prince Charming, and I'm going to wait to find my husband and settle down, have my children. That way, no egg freezing, no technology involved. And she was like, okay, but I just turned 40 today, and you're about to turn 40 in 2 weeks. So um, she's like, I really think you should just seriously consider it. Maybe just look into it. Maybe just make an appointment. And I was like, you know what? All right, I'm going to think about it. And I didn't talk to her about it again. What's hilarious is I didn't speak to her about it again until like a couple months after it was done. Like I never talked to her about it again. I let it go. She let it go. She let me sit with it. And it took me probably maybe like a few days. And then I started just making phone calls around to different doctors. You need to find a reproductive endocrinologist, which we'll talk about later. And I was able to get an appointment, and it just went from there. Like that, it was literally, that's exactly how it happened.
Oh, wow.
Wow. And if you don't mind me asking, when you followed up with your friend, was she shocked that you went through with it without telling her? I'm sorry,
she was. She was just like, so when were you going to tell me this? I was just like, well, I just told you. She was like, okay, but this was, but she knows me really well. So she knows like once I decide something, I'll just execute. So that's what I was focused on after that. But she was very happy. She really was pleased. She was like, yeah, this is a good idea. So
Got you. So my next question is, as you were deciding, so I know your friend kind of initiated it, but did you share with anybody else as you were going through the process, like any family and friends? And what was the feedback that they gave you?
Okay, so my mom is a former registered nurse. She retired from nursing after a bit over 40 years. And so I told my mom. I didn't tell anyone else in my family, and I told one of my girlfriends here because she actually I didn't tell her when I first made the decision and I first started going through the process. I told her later as the process was ongoing, because quite frankly, I also needed her to come with me to a couple of the medical appointments towards the very, very end of the process. But that's it. I didn't tell anyone. And Something that I think I really want to mention, I wasn't dating anyone at the time. But if I had been dating someone, if the person was not like my life partner or my husband, I probably would not have told that person. Just because I think when it comes to things like talking about a woman's reproductive chances and fertility and all these other things, I just think like you may be inadvertently putting pressure on a man who may not be ready to be dealing with that kind of conversation. I froze my eggs for me, right? I froze my eggs for my own potential, future chances of having a child. So that's my 2 cents on that. Someone else may feel differently, like maybe they told their boyfriend, that they were freezing their eggs, and that's fine. There's obviously more than one way to do something. But for me personally, I don't think I would have told anyone, unless it was like my husband or life partner, and we planned to actually use those eggs together.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would probably go that route too, unless it was my husband, just because, sometimes when you're dating, you do feel like, oh, this is forever, but sometimes it's just not. And so, what's the point of bringing that up if eventually it's not even something that's relevant to that person? So, I'm completely on board with that. Did your mom have any reactions, or was it just full support?
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't answer that part. So my mom was like, okay. I mean, she was like, all right. She's like, what are you going to do with them afterwards? I was like, let them sit there. So, and my girlfriend here was like, oh yeah. She's like, that's a great idea. I mean, I really didn't meet any resistance. And also I remember I was also 40 years old.
Right.
So I had been dating, you know what I mean? It's not like I said I was going to do this at 30, which I think may have gotten me more resistance than saying I wanted to do it at 40. But by the way, and we'll talk about this later, you should do it earlier than 40. So...
Oh, okay. I can't wait to hear about that.
Yes, it worked out for me, but still do it earlier.
Yeah. So I know we talked about like what response you got then, but now when you bring this up in conversation, what response do you get from people now?
Oh, that's a great question. So I don't really bring it up that often. In fact, it's really weird that I even told you all. I mean, I think I've just become more comfortable because I'm getting older. It was now almost 5 years ago. And in the last year, I think I've opened up a little bit more about it. Plus, you see people more openly talking about it in society. Yeah. Right. And so, but really the response that I've gotten has been fine. I mean, no one has said anything to my face that they thought I was crazy. Everyone seemed to think it was a good idea. I mean, they've known me a long time. They know I don't have a partner or a spouse. Like, it's a well thought out decision. So someone may feel some kind of way about it, but they haven't said anything to me. And if they do, that's fine too. I mean, I recognize that everyone makes different choices, but this is my choice. So that's how I look at it.
And I could only, I can't imagine, I guess, what the negative responses or pushbacks would be, because this whole process just gives you more options and more choices. So yeah, I couldn't imagine kind of where that conversation would go in the opposite direction.
I think it has to do with, honestly, that's a really good point, Yosha. I think it has to do with the fact that there is this narrative since slavery that Black women are just endlessly fertile. And so people, and it's an elective procedure. You're going to come out of your own pocket, which we'll talk about later. In most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases. And so, people are going to be like, why are you spending money on that? I definitely can see that there, especially in our community, it's like, why would you do that? Why don't you just wait for your husband? Are you not waiting on the Lord? Are you not, you know what I mean? Like, essentially that I'm taking my own life into my hands. And, in some ways I am, but in some ways I'm not. It's one of those things.
Yeah, I can definitely see that now that you bring that perspective up, because I have heard things like, oh, well, we can have kids for forever, girl. We don't have those types of problems.
Yes.
And it's like, those are big assumptions about something as serious as our health. So I wanted to ask you if you could just tell us a little bit about what the process entailed for you. So like, how long did it take, doctor's appointments, anything that you had to do at home?
Yes. Okay. So here is the meat and potatoes. So basically, this process is it is created with a medical protocol. So there are different protocols. There's probably at least 4 or 5 different protocols, and the protocols have different medications in them, but they all do the same thing. They all stimulate the follicles in your ovaries to produce to mature multiple eggs, instead of just one egg that you get every month when you menstruate. The one egg that, you know, goes through the whole cycle and eventually gets discarded because it's not used, or if it is used, you get pregnant. Instead of one egg, trying to get as many as you can. I've heard really as few as literally someone stimulated and getting 2 eggs, and I've heard as few as 2 eggs, and I've heard someone getting stimulating and producing literally like 40 eggs. So it's a big, and that should tell you all something. And for the listeners, fertility is a very individual thing. It is a very individual thing. People think like, my mother had 10 children, I should be able to have 10 children. In theory, yes. In actuality, sometimes the answer is no. And so the process is about 6 weeks. No matter which protocol you use, it's probably going to be at least 5 weeks. It could be a bit longer if you require more stimulation of your particular follicles. Everyone's body is different, as we know. We've seen this in COVID, how COVID impacts people differently. Fertility is the same way. And so it took me, for my process, it was 6 weeks. The first part of the 6 weeks is just going in. You have to go see the reproductive endocrinologist, and it's timed to your menstrual period. So that's the wild thing too. Like it's tied to essentially like when you're going to ovulate, just to go and get a checkup. And the checkup is, you're going to get some blood work done. You're going to test what's called your AMH, which just means anti-murulin hormone. That's the hormone that essentially detects the hormones that the eggs that are in the follicles. There's a hormone that is released into your bloodstream. And the higher the rate of AMH, the more eggs you have. That's why AMH is so critical. Okay, you're going to get another test for your follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and that just means like literally how much FSH do you have, and the numbers vary depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle. So you're going to get some blood work done, and you're also, believe it or not, going to get your uterine and ovarian cavity like checked out. You're going to get a physical exam, like a GYN exam, and an ultrasound to see what's going on in there. Okay, after that, and once that is clear, then the reproductive endocrinologist that you work with and the nurse that you work with, they're going to time the injections, because you all know that, I think you knew that was coming, the injections that you'll have to give yourself, or you'll have to ask someone to give to you if you are afraid of injecting yourself. You will get your injection, your protocol, your medication protocol. And you'll, in my case, I had to go to a special pharmacy. Like literally there was one Walgreens in the whole of Metro Atlanta that dispensed these fertility medications. So that's another thing. Depending on the medications that you're prescribed, like you may not just be able to go down the street to your local pharmacy and get, you may have to go to this one pharmacy. And again, this is out of pocket. Most insurance does not, health insurance does not cover egg freezing. It is an elective procedure. It's not necessary. Obviously, I don't have to freeze my eggs to survive, right? So it's an elective procedure. Some companies like Google and Facebook have decided to pay for it on behalf of their female employees in the last, like, I don't know, 10 years or less, which is awesome, right? That's awesome. But just know it's an elective procedure. So to I guess make a long story short, once I went and picked up and it's a gigantic box of medications because it's a whole bunch of vials. It's enough vials for at least 2, in my case, at least 2 weeks of stimulation. And what it really involves is literally the pharmacist explains to you how to do it when you go pick up the box. Like, yes, literally, like this is the proper needle for this particular medication in this vial. This is the proper needle for this one. And the protocol will be some combination of follicle stimulating hormones where you give yourselves an injection 2 to 3 times a day, usually in your abdomen. Some doctors will say you can do it in your upper thigh. It's basically near the area, right? Near your reproductive area. I did it in my abdomen. You do it 2 to 3 times a day, and it is timed. You have to do it you got to do it at the same time each day, like the 2 to 3 times a day, each day for the 2 weeks. So one day I was out on a date somewhere in Buckhead or something. I had to like quietly excuse myself and go into the bathroom. Seriously, I brought it with me a Ziploc bag, brought the medication, brought the needle with me. I had to like inject myself in the bathroom in the restaurant, and then, you know, come out and sit down and resume the date. So
Wow.
that's
Oh my gosh.
that's you got to do that for 2 to 3 weeks. And then and again, it depends on how much stimulation you're going to need. And all the while, after the first appointment, the couple of weeks before you, or it's maybe like 3 to 4 weeks before you start the injections, after that first appointment, you don't go back to the doctor until after you actually started stimulating yourself. And then as the 2 week window or 2 to 3 week window, depending on how much stimulation you need, you know, gets further and further along, you'll start going into the doctor like basically almost every day to get an ultrasound to see how your ovaries are, because they should be big. You know, the bigger the better, quite frankly. For some people, they won't be as large because they just don't have as many eggs. But ideally, in a perfect world, if you have a healthy woman with a good ovarian egg reserve, when I say, I mean big, huge balls. And you should be able to, you know, the nurse should be able to very clearly, the doctor should be able to see them very clearly as you stimulate more and more. And so, yeah, that's basically the procedure. The final part of it is at the very end, you take an injection to essentially prime the eggs to be easily like retrieved. And the egg retrieval process, that's like an injection that you take the night before the egg retrieval. The egg retrieval is usually early the next morning. And it is a simple procedure. Honestly, it's just literally almost like a turkey baster. It's a needle, it's an aspirator. You take the reproductive endocrinologist sticks the needle in through your, you know, your and up to your ovaries, and literally just starts she can see them on the screen, right? And starts literally like basically taking them out with the needle. You're under anesthesia, so you don't know any of this is going on.
Okay.
Yeah, you're under anesthesia. Let me, I should have prefaced that. Yeah, you're under anesthesia. So it's a real medical procedure. And that I want to make that very clear for anyone listening. It is a real medical procedure. You will need to be knocked out because nobody wants to see a big needle being inserted inside themselves. And that's it. And it literally should take, it takes less than an hour. In fact, it may even take less than 30 minutes, depending on how many eggs are retrieved. In my case, at age 40 years and 1 month, I did it a month after I turned 40. They retrieved 22 eggs, which for my age is a lot. For my age back then was a lot. 22 eggs, 17 of them were mature enough to freeze. So I have 17 frozen, they call them oocytes, 17 frozen eggs at one of the local hospitals. Yeah.
Wow. So I have a couple of questions that we didn't send to you, but that just kind of came up. I was wondering if you know, are there any health things that need to be done before you take this? For example, I know fibroids tend to be common in African-American women. So like would fibroids be something that need to be removed prior to this happening? And then the second thing was, how long was your healing process like after that final procedure?
Oh, that's a great question. So the first question is, I know someone else. So I had 2 tiny fibroids. When I say tiny, I mean like tiny, probably smaller than a dime. One inside and one outside my uterus. Before I had this procedure, I now have a few more fibroids and they're bigger because of the hormones that I stimulated myself with cause the, you know, fibroids, PCOS, all of these conditions are generally a result of too much estrogen. It's estrogen dominance, right? And so part of the stimulation process is makes your estrogen levels go, whoo, it's like you're pregnant, like really like your late pregnancy by the end. And so even though it was a small window, believe it or not, it actually made my fibroids much worse. So if you already have fibroids because of what I just explained, like how I had 2 tiny ones and then they became a couple more and significantly bigger, you need to discuss it very carefully with the reproductive endocrinologist, because it's not so much, unless the fibroid is blocking essentially blocking their ability to get the eggs from your ovary, it's probably not a problem in terms of the actual procedure, but it could wreak havoc on your system. The hormones stimulating, that could wreak havoc and make your fibroid issues much, much worse. And it won't take that long. I mean, you're not gonna, they're not going to expand and grow in a couple of weeks, but months, in a few more months, in a year, you might have more and bigger fibroids.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part one. To answer the second part of your question, in terms of recovery, I'm going to be very honest with y'all. The most pain I've ever been in my life was the day after this procedure. So far, COVID was rough for me too, but the most pain, physical pain I've ever been in my life was the day after this procedure for about 24 hours. Like just that one morning when I woke up. Thank God I had been prescribed. My girlfriend, the same girlfriend, had, when we finished at the procedure, before she took me home from the hospital, she stopped at the pharmacy and filled the prescriptions that the doctor recommended. And so I had the meds. And I took them. I was still in a lot of pain. When I said I can't really describe the pain, it was not necessarily emanating to me. It didn't feel like it was coming from my uterus or reproductive system area. Like my legs, like the top of my thighs, which obviously are close to that area. I can't describe. It just was very hard. And it was so hard, like it was so painful. I don't even know if I ate anything that day. I may have drank some water. I was just in so much pain. But the strangest part is like eventually, meds like that have to kind of build up in your system. So I took one in the morning, I took one like midday, and by the third or fourth pill, it started feeling better enough for me to sleep. And then miraculously, I woke up the second day after the procedure and I was perfectly fine. It is I can't. So I personally think my body is very sensitive to hormones. And I just think that burst of hormones that you get right before they're going to take the eggs out. And then once they take the eggs out, it's like the hormone levels drop drastically. So I chalk it up to that, but I was fine. There is a condition, it's very, very rare, but there is a condition for a very small group of women, after they have their eggs removed, their body does something weird. It basically starts, it's almost like, you hear about pregnant women towards the very, very end where their bodies swell with all this water and like their electrolytes get out of balance. There is a similar condition like that. It's very rare for some people who have had this procedure. So you kind of have to watch it. That's why you have to be the first day or two after the procedure, you got to really be paying attention to your body. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it's a rare complication.
And were these like strong meds like Percocet or just like,
yes.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Yes. That's
like, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even aside from that rare condition, it sounds like it's very close to like a postpartum hormonal dump, like after you give birth. So it sounds pretty similar to that, but actually elevated because your hormones aren't gradually increasing over the course of 10, 11 months. It's like within a few short weeks.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Instead of 40 weeks, it's like 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's just like your estrogen levels by the time you're ready to take the eggs out are just like astronomical. Like it's wild. And the more eggs you have, of course, the higher your level. So, that's why this is such a unique and individual experience. I don't want to scare anyone. I would do it over again tomorrow if I had to. I don't want to scare anyone, but I want you all to know the truth. I want you from my perspective and that these things are possibilities.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about cost earlier and how this was something that your insurance didn't cover. Yes. And so if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit more information of kind of what that experience was like for you from a financial standpoint and just maybe the reality of, I would say, like normal women doing this, not celebrities.
Yes. So that's the thing that I've heard a lot just out there in the world. The couple of times that I've talked to people who were going to do this procedure, I just happen to know them and they happen to be talking about it. And they're like, oh, nobody understands because it's only celebrities. We've only seen celebrities do this. Like I've definitely heard that before. It cost me $13,000 out of pocket. Most of that is the medication because these pharmaceutical companies, these meds are not cheap. Most of that is the medication, and quite frankly, the 15 million ultrasounds that when you're pregnant, you go to the doctor at the end all the time. It's the multiple ultrasounds you need to be able to look at the growth of the egg sacs. That's really what the bulk of the cost is. And I was able to pay for it. It was not a problem for me. I do know of people who were able to take out a loan. There are specialized companies that offer loans, 1 to usually 3-year loans in terms of repayment, who will pay up front the cost for you, or the medical center or the hospital will bill this loan company. They'll pay the whole thing, and then the loan company will, send you your monthly payments, your invoice, and you just pay over the predetermined period of it's usually, I think, like 1 to 3 years, as I said. Even now, that was back in 2017, and it cost me 13 grand in Metro Atlanta. Even now, it's usually somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 for the whole thing. And it varies also based on location. Like, definitely, it's more expensive to do this in New York City and Los Angeles, and DC, hands down. Okay, it's maybe going to be cheaper to do this in the middle of Iowa. Okay, like it's dependent upon location. There's a lot of things that kind of factor into it. But just reasonably expect to pay between $10,000 and $20,000. And there is also, that's the cost of the whole thing, the medication, the as I said, the ultrasounds, the doctor's visits, also the procedures in that cost. So the procedure is accounted for in there. The only thing that's not accounted for is the storage cost. I pay $400 every year, the anniversary every year of the procedure. I pay $400 to store the eggs, to keep storing them. And these eggs can be stored really for a long time. I mean, a few years ago, some doctors implanted, were able to unfreeze an egg, thaw an egg, mix it with someone's sperm, and implant an embryo. And the mother gave birth, 9-10 months later. And that egg was 24 years old or something like that. It had been frozen a long time.
Is that storage fee just like a flat rate, or based on how many eggs are like retrieved?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I've always assumed it was a flat rate because it's the same storage fee every year. And this is my 5th year. I mean, I pay it every July. Yeah, that's a really good question. It may be because, again, it is actually more, the average person who is between like 35 and 40 who does the egg retrieval process and has eggs frozen, it's more typical to get 3 to 10 eggs, and then all of those won't be mature. In most cases, you'll get at least a couple that are not mature enough to be in the freezer. So that's much more common. But again, I've heard of someone literally getting 40 eggs. Like, it depends on your ovarian reserve. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation. It just so happens that I have, even back then at age 40, I have pretty high ovarian reserve. Even today at age almost 45, my AMH levels are significantly higher than they should be, which is great, but my eggs are old, right? My eggs are old. So if I ever have a child, my guess is I'm going to need to use those frozen eggs because they're younger than what my eggs are today. But some of us are going to be very fortunate. And I would encourage you, if you are 30 years old, and whether you're married or you're single, but you haven't had any children at all, if you're 30, some people would say do it younger, but most 20-something-year-olds are not interested in this kind of stuff. I would say by the time when a woman starts hitting around 30, then these other conversations kind of come into play. I would say if you're 30 and you don't have any children, please go to a reproductive endocrinologist or at least your GYN and ask them to give you an AMH and an FSH blood test. It's just like any other blood test. You're not going to feel any more pain than normal. It's out of your arm. They don't have to stick your stomach. It's, just a regular blood test. And the results will come back and they'll be able to interpret them for you. So at least if you have average AMH level for your age, or maybe some of you are going to have more. I had more. Unfortunately, some of you are going to have less. And when you have less than is average for your age, that may mean that you have what's called diminished ovarian reserve. And if you find that out at 30, I promise you, it is better to find that out at 30 than find it out at 40. That's why I say I should have done this before. I had higher than average ovarian reserve, but what if I did not? When I did this at 40, it worked out for me. I got a good number of eggs. But what if I didn't have that? What if I had diminished ovarian reserve? I could have maybe only had 1 or 2 eggs and tried to thaw them and they didn't become embryos when they tried to fertilize. I mean, anything can happen. Even now, even with the number of eggs I have now, there are no guarantees that any of them will be, when fertilized with sperm, will become an embryo. There's a better chance the more eggs you have. There's a much better chance. Every additional egg gives you a better chance. but there are still no guarantees. Just like we know in the real world, outside of medical intervention, some people get pregnant 4 times a year and miscarry every single time. There's a lot that goes into this, as you all know, a lot of variables to make an actual human being.
Yes, I was going to say I had a similar conversation with my previous OB, and she basically was just like, we shouldn't be making assumptions about our fertility health just because we think that we're young, we have time. And she was just like, I understand that women are taking slightly different paths today than we may have 20, 30 years ago, but your reproductive timeline is a real thing.
Mhm.
And so, like you said, she mentioned the age 30, maybe even a few years younger, age 27. If you feel like you're that person who isn't in a rush to have children, even if you are married or in a relationship, at least get your hormone levels tested so that you're making a decision from an informed standpoint and not just assuming, because all the women in my family have easily gotten pregnant, or I knew this person who had a baby at 50,
Yes,
using
which is tough.
anecdotal evidence to make decisions about, such a sensitive and important area of our lives.
And some people think all the women in their family had such an easy job, but like as you start digging, you find out there's a lot of history there where people waited several years before they were able to. It's just not something that maybe that generation had talked about. So this is a very timely conversation because most of my friends are turning 30 this year. So this is definitely a timely conversation. I wanted to ask you, because you have talked about things that were like uncomfortable and painful during this process. What would you say was the most uncomfortable thing about this whole process? And then what was the most rewarding?
The most uncomfortable thing, I mean, 2 things. It's not fun to stick yourself. I mean, God bless those who are, especially those who have juvenile diabetes and for the longest time had to really stick themselves with real needles. Now they have those devices that make it a lot less painful. But when I was growing up, my friends who had juvenile diabetes, they had regular needles and they stuck themselves right, it hurt. And just imagine doing that in your abdomen. At some point, quite frankly, just from the injection site and trying to vary the injection site around my abdomen, like my abdomen began to harden a little bit. It wasn't temporary. The pharmacist told me that might happen and it would eventually relax, but just the constant like tensing of that was not fun, but it wasn't the end of the world. So that was one challenging thing. The other challenging thing is, like I said, the day after that procedure, and I was in pain. I don't know. I may feel pain like that again if I ever have a child, but that one day, boy, I literally like was delirious with pain at one point. Before the meds really built up enough in my system to make a difference. So those were the 2 most challenging parts. And then the best part was after the procedure was done and I recovered from, the difficult day after, and then as more days passed. Honestly, you just have a different way. For me, I just started viewing the world differently. I felt like the things that I was putting on hold, I started doing. I started making plans to save some money so I could buy a house, and I did the next summer, not that summer, but the next one. To save up money and everything, I decided, I was just gonna do things. I started traveling by myself more and just doing all kinds of. I really just started living my life, I think, more because I had always, like many women, I don't think I'm the only one, certainly. I'd been saying like, oh, I'm gonna wait for my husband to have this experience and that experience. And all of those things are wonderful. And I think it's a really sweet, loving gesture to think in your head like, oh, I want to share this experience with this person. I get it. But there are no guarantees in life. Sadly, we know that there are no guarantees in life. And so I really stopped planning for this person who was not there at the time and, who may materialize someday. I'm in a long-term relationship now and it's awesome. But I really just started living. So that was it basically freed me up to do other stuff because now I didn't have to look at every single man like I dated, like, oh, is this my last chance of meeting someone who might settle down with me? And as sad as that sounds, I really think that at some point I started feeling that way. Like, I was 40. Like, is this my last chance? Is this, do I have to go out of my way to be on my absolute best behavior? I feel like even at that stage, like, I feel like I couldn't necessarily even always be myself. I was very much sometimes like walking on eggshells when going on dates and things because you don't know what someone's proclivities are, what turns them off. and once I had those eggs in that freezer, boy, I, I was like,
Your girl is free.
yeah, I
You
was
got me tearing up, Stacey-Ann. I'm like, oh.
yeah, yeah, I mean, once I had them in the freezer, honestly, like it's again, there are still no guarantees that those will produce a child for me, but now there's more of a chance, and it just made me feel like I could get fully my life back and I could fully be myself, and I didn't have to be so concerned with like finding a man. Because I will say something else, and I don't know, I know that you all are younger than me. I know that you all are, I believe, in your early 30s or about to be 30. For me, I can speak, and I know Miosha, you already mentioned that you have a child. So this probably won't happen to you because you already have a child. But when I was 35 or 36, I began to notice that my body started doing weird things. My mind started doing weird things. Like I would be in a grocery store and someone's young, small toddler or whatever would be in the back, like I'd be in the front by the cash register, and someone's toddler in the back by the seafood or something, or the meat section would start screaming and crying. And before 35 or 36, like I would hear it. I'd be like, oh, it's, hope that child is okay. They're probably stressed out or whatever you do when you're that age that stresses you out. But, I didn't really think much of it. When 35, 36 hit and I didn't have a child yet, like my mind started like acutely focusing on like this child, and like your brain and your body do something, because reproduction is probably the most important thing that your body thinks about other than keeping you alive. Right. And so your brain and your body start to almost like play tricks on you when you get to a certain age and you have not had a child. Like your attention towards like it's hard to explain. And I thought I was going crazy. I was like, well, maybe it's just me because whatever. But then I started asking some of my other friends who are around the same age or even older who don't have children, like, did you ever have an experience like this? And all the women said they did. So it's something if you don't have a child, for apparently not just me, but even some other people, like your body at a certain age is going to start being like, okay, what's going on? Like, where's yours? Like, you hear that child back there? Where is yours?
I feel like it's the opposite. When you have kids, you don't even hear it anymore. You're like, oh, that kid is crying.
Is that mine? I don't know. Oh man. So just thinking back to when you suggested this topic for the podcast, why do you think it's an important conversation for women, but especially Black women, to have?
So I really want us as a community to get our heads out of the sand. I see this very often, and it's women in general, but it's especially Black women and other women of color who have been conditioned to believe that we're just endlessly fertile. It's like one of the vestiges of slavery. It's a lot of like brainwashing and stereotyping and all these things that we've been led to believe. Yes, some of us aren't, we can see that, right? That's why certain women who were enslaved ended up being not only mothers of, many, many children, they were even nurses for the, slave owners' family. And all. Yes, to some extent, okay, I get it. But in general, fertility is a very individual thing. Unfortunately and sadly, I know people who found out basically they're infertile at like age 29, who had been married since they were 25 and been trying to have children, and they found out that they were infertile. Now, sometimes it's not the woman, sometimes it's the man, sometimes it's actually both people, sometimes it's the woman and the man. But fertility is such an individual thing. It is not smart of us to assume, especially as we get older, to assume that we are always going to be able to have children without the help of science and medicine. Some of us are going to be very blessed and very fortunate to be able to do that. Most of us will. Infertility is not something that affects most people. But for that, 10% or so, it's better for you to find that out at age 30 than it is for you to find it out at age 40, because at age 40, and as you get older than that, your eggs, the mitochondria that are used to basically, they're the energy source of all of our cells, including eggs, which we know is a cell that eventually divides many times until it becomes a person. The mitochondria are just growing weaker and weaker over time as we age. And that's the same thing for the mitochondria that, keep your eggs healthy and, in good condition. And so that's what, so again, I still have a lot of eggs for my age. I just did an AMH test like 2 months ago, and my doctor was like, your AMH is pretty good. She's like, you could probably get pregnant still. But the issue is these are old eggs. It's probably, they are more likely to have chromosomal abnormalities and things like that. So again, I just want us to take our heads out of the sand, to not think, not assume that all of us are going to be equally fertile. I promise you, that's not the case. I also promise you that some of you know people who have had children actually with medical assistance. Either they had to take, Clomid shots to basically force like multiple ovulations at one time to help them get pregnant, or they had to use IVF. They just didn't tell you. They just did not tell you. I promise you that some of you know people who needed assistance, and they just didn't tell you, but they have a beautiful, healthy child that you love. And that's all you need to know, right? That's all you need to know. So, yes.
Yes. So if another woman were to come to you and say that she was considering freezing her eggs, what are some things you would tell her to be aware of or to think about before she starts the process?
The biggest thing, which I haven't talked about really at all, is that again, and you alluded to it earlier, Miosha, when you're pumping your body full of hormones, an insane amount of hormones in a very short period of time. Like, just if you are someone who suffers from PMS, particularly bad PMS, just imagine that like to the 10th power. And so there will be, in some people's cases, for me, there will be a roller coaster of emotions that are being basically driven by your body's response to the hormone levels that it is experiencing for the first time. So that's one, your mental state because of the hormone injections. Then number two, the emotions that you may, or this depending on you as an individual, you may or may not feel around having to even do this or having to even consider this kind of procedure. I felt empowered in some ways because I'm like, okay, I know what's going on with my body. I know generally what my ovarian reserve is. That's great. I have some information, but I also felt really embarrassed. I felt really angry with myself, and to some extent, I think with God, like, why am I even having, like, why do I even have to be in this position to be thinking about this? Like, why don't I have a husband or a partner already? Why am I 40 and still without a husband or a partner? Why is this my particular fate in life? And I think that's something that no one really talks about. Like, if you are going through, egg freezing is the first part of IVF for those of you who aren't aware. This is the first part. The next part is literally taking the eggs that were retrieved, mixing them with sperm in a test tube, and then letting them do whatever they're going to do and divide a bunch of times until they become enough cells to implant, essentially, as an embryo. And that from then, the embryo gets implanted, and hopefully it will keep growing and become a full, fledged baby that can be birthed into the world. So for those people who go through the process with a partner or a spouse, they have someone to help them. That's like, team goal, we're going to have a baby. This is what we're doing. This is the end result. When you go through it by yourself, I think the emotions are probably different. The end result when you freeze eggs, right? I could take my eggs right now and use a sperm donor if I wanted to. I mean, I'm in a relationship, but let's just say I wasn't in a relationship. I could take my eggs right now, use a sperm donor, and go through the whole process and perhaps produce a baby, right? It's like a different kind of conversation, but most people who freeze their eggs don't use the eggs right away. It's not like IVF where you go through the rest of the process right away, or in the next like month or so, basically. It's not like that. The eggs are still chilling at the hospital, right? 5 years later. So it's a different feeling. Like, it's just a different emotional feel. It's really interesting. And I would want her to consider all of the things I just talked about, the hormone roller coaster, and then your own internal feelings about this decision that you've made, and try not to beat yourself up about it. That's what I would say.
Yes. So last question. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us. I've been learning a lot. But are there any resources that you found helpful that you'd like to share?
So I would say when I went through this almost 5 years ago, I mean, Google is still your best friend. Some of the resources that I used then, I mean, the procedure, the IVF, the egg freezing IVF process has not changed really materially since it was introduced in this. It's really, the protocols maybe, the medications may be different, but it's basically the same process. So I'm not worried about, giving you incorrect information. What I said will still be true. But there are always new studies. There are always new medications used to stimulate the ovaries. So I would encourage you all to do a Google search, look for egg freezing clinic, egg freezing procedure, and just read the latest up-to-date information. And I would also encourage you all to watch this documentary on OWN called Eggs Over Easy. It's narrated by Keisha Knight Pulliam. It was released January 2022, so just last month. It is a great documentary about not just egg freezing, with single women, but also IVF, people who choose not to have children. There's a young woman on there, and she's probably younger than me. I mean, if I'm 44, she's probably still in her late 30s. She did a tubal ligation. Like, she never wants children, never had children, does not want children, and wanted permanent birth control. And she was able to finally find a doctor who would tie her tubes. She did that, and that's her choice. And so it covers all of these topics. It covers general infertility. Like I said, it covers basically everything. It covers a young woman and her husband. She has polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS. Again, another estrogen dominant challenge of the fertility of the reproductive system. There's a whole, segment on her and, their journey, and maybe they might use a donor egg. For those of you who don't know, this is when people donate eggs and get paid for it. This is what you do. People who can't have children may select a donor egg, just like someone who doesn't have a male partner may use a sperm donor. So yes, those are the resources I would say. Definitely do a thorough Google search and check out Eggs Over Easy. I watched it myself. It's obviously very compelling.
Nice. Wow. Well, thank you so much for being an open book and for sharing everything that you went through and giving advice. Yeah, like I said, a lot of people in my life are turning 30 this year, so very timely, and we greatly appreciate you. Thank you guys, listeners, for tuning in to this episode of the Girlfriends and Goals podcast. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Girlfriends and Goals podcast. And if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and do that now. Don't forget to rate, review, and share. Until next time, bye.
Bye.
Bye.